Nashville, Tennessee. In 1997, a serial killer is preying on restaurant employees. He leaves no clues and tries to murder all witnesses. Prosecutors work with homicide detectives to identify the murderer and end his killing spree, while a terrified community wonders where the predator will strike next.
Nobody should die that way.
I've never seen anything that horrific.
One of the duties of a pathologist is to determine the cause of death.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
Make sure to like and subscribe.
See Assistant Attorney General Tom Henderson worked with other prosecutors and local police in an intense search for an elusive and vicious killer.
He was void of any emotions. He wouldn't kill you or kill me without a reason, but if we had a dollar he wanted, he'd kill us for it, and without any thought or without any remorse.
At noon on February 16, 1997, police responded to a seafood restaurant in a suburb of Nashville, Tennessee. They had been called by the restaurant chain's district manager. He was concerned because the restaurant hadn't opened on time. No one had answered his phone calls, though an employee's car was in the parking lot. No employees seemed to be inside. The restaurant's safe was open and empty. So was the cash register. Police hoped it had just been a robbery. Then, they discovered two bodies, dead from multiple gunshot wounds. Officers called in an apparent double homicide.
Medics, crime scene search unit, major crimes detectives.
The victims were employee Sarah Jackson, a 16-year-old high school junior, and store manager Steve Hampton, a 25-year-old father of three. Nashville Metro Police homicide detective Pat Pastiglione responded to the scene.
When I arrived, what my job is, after I interview the initial detectives, is to perform what they call a walkthrough. I go with the ID techs and we go through the entire crime scene. In this particular case, what struck me was that the crime scene was not what we call a typical crime scene, if there is such a thing. This crime scene was very clean. The place looked like it was ready to open at any minute. The tables were all neatly arranged. It was not your typical ransacked type crime scene.
Police determined that both victims had been shot in the head, execution style. 12 total shots had been fired. The brutal efficiency of the crime indicated an experienced criminal was responsible.
The person that did this probably has done the same thing in the past in the way the crime scene was left, the fact that the business was locked, delaying discovery of the victims, and the cold-blooded nature in which the victims were killed.
An audit of the cash register receipts revealed that $6,000 to $7,000 had been taken. Forensic technicians processed the restaurant, recovering dozens of latent fingerprints. They would be compared to known prints of employees in an attempt to uncover foreign prints, perhaps from the killer. The only sign of disarray was a trash bag on the floor.
Underneath the trash bag, we found a shoe print, and we knew that that shoe print was made prior to the bag being placed there. And we know that because the store was cleaned and mopped prior to that, and both victims' shoe prints were eliminated from that particular print. So we knew we had something at least to go on.
The size of the print suggested it had been left by an adult male. The crime scene indicated that the victims had not put up a fight.
There was nothing to suggest that the victims resisted in any way, shape, or form. I think that's the part that upset us the most when we got to the crime scene, was the fact that these young kids did nothing other than cooperate with this man. He still felt it necessary to eliminate them in our mind as witnesses, and that's exactly what he did.
The two witnesses inside had been killed. But then the detective noticed a security camera on a nearby bank building. It was pointed directly at the rear entrance of the restaurant. If the killer had run out that way, his image might have been captured and an identification could be made. Detectives requested the bank's video footage for review. While detectives checked on the bank video, a medical examiner performed autopsies. He extracted several .32 caliber slugs from the bodies of the victims. The slugs were sent to a ballistics lab for further examination. Detectives hoped the bank's video footage would give them a suspect. But they soon found out the camera had been undergoing repairs on the night of the double murder. They hoped another lead would surface soon. The lead came quickly. On the day the bodies were discovered, a man walking along Ellington Parkway noticed identity cards in the grass. They were for the children of Steve Hampton, the store manager who had been killed. It was just a few miles from the crime scene. The man contacted police, who responded to the parkway.
We fanned out across Ellington Parkway and we walked 3.1 miles all the way down, and we found 7 or 8 items belonging to Steve Hampton. Library cards, insurance cards, driver's license, movie rental cards. As it turns out, the person that committed the robbery was throwing these items out along Ellington Parkway as he drove.
Investigators hoped the cards would yield physical evidence.
And we were fortunate because on the movie rental card, we found a portion of a thumbprint, a right thumbprint.
Examiners compared the print to those of Steve Hampton and his family.
We felt comfortable that the print probably belonged to the suspect. We know it didn't belong to the victim or anybody associated with the victim that we knew of. So our hope was this print belongs to the killer.
Ballistics examination might provide another link to the killer. Examiners compared the .32 caliber slugs recovered from the victims. The lands and grooves etched into the surface of each slug indicated they had been fired from the same handgun. If detectives recovered a weapon, examiners might be able to link the slugs to the gun. Going over the ballistics and autopsy reports, the detective noted the suspect had emptied his gun and reloaded it. The use of such force against compliant victims indicated they were looking for an exceptionally dangerous individual.
The type of person that clearly has no conscience, the type of person that's just cold-blooded and cunning, and that's what we think we were dealing with. Somebody who's able to talk themselves into a business, slick enough to get inside the business and convince the people, even at gunpoint, that if you do what I say, everything will be okay.
Hoping to develop more information, detectives questioned 3 teenagers who had worked at the seafood restaurant the night before the murders. They recalled that just before closing, a man had come by the restaurant looking for work. He was wearing an apron from another restaurant chain. They gave him a job application and said he should come back in the morning to see the manager, Steve Hampton. The teenagers didn't know if the man had come back in the morning, but detectives found evidence that he did.
As it turns out, we have another witness located the following day, the day of the murder. She sees a tall male white standing out in front of this business with a white piece of paper in his hand, speaking to Steve Hampton. We suspect that white piece of paper was a job application given to him the night before.
The witnesses described the suspect as a muscular white male who might have had a slight mustache. Police canvassed residential areas and businesses near the restaurant, hoping someone would recognize the sketch. But no one did. If the man who met Steve Hampton on the morning of the murder was the killer, no one seemed to know who he was. Because the suspect had worn an apron from a restaurant chain, investigators did background checks on all 400 area employees of the chain. The background checks generated no new leads. A month after the murders, investigators feared the case was going cold. Then, just after midnight on March 23, 1997, Nashville police received a 911 call. The caller sounded injured, but before he could relay any details, the line went dead. The operator traced the call to a hamburger restaurant in an eastern suburb of the city and dispatched officers. Among those responding was Nashville Metro Police Detective Mike Rowland.
The initial appearance was everything was okay. Everything was locked up. There were a few cars in the parking lot. When they started looking through the windows, they were able to see a trail of blood and at least one body back in the back of the restaurant.
Police had to break through the restaurant's locked doors.
There were 4 victims at this scene. 2 victims were still alive and 2 victims were deceased. The 2 that were still alive, Jose Gonzalez and Andrea Brown, were immediately transported to a local hospital.
17-year-old Andrea Brown did not survive the night. Like the 2 other fatalities, she would die from multiple gunshot wounds. Her co-worker, Jose Gonzalez, had been stabbed 17 times. When paramedics found him, he had stopped breathing. They worked frantically to save his life. Investigators began to process the crime scene.
There was a large amount of blood. There were also what appeared to be a large amount of footprints in the blood. All through the back, the break room, the hallway, the office, the storeroom, there was pretty much blood everywhere on the floors.
Forensic technicians worked to determine if any of the blood belonged to the killer.
One thing that we would hope would be that the suspect might have gotten injured in some way and we would be able to obtain suspect DNA.
No discernible foreign fingerprints were recovered, and police found no murder weapon.
There were 25 caliber shell casings. We located all the shell casings. Some of them were obviously right out in the open. Some of them we had to get down under things and try to find.
A total of 6 bullets had been fired. A medical examiner retrieved bullet fragments from the victims and forwarded them to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab. Examiners there determined they had come from a .25 caliber handgun. It was not the same caliber of weapon used in the earlier murders at the seafood restaurant. Detectives Bastiglione and Rowland learned the shoe prints from the 2 robbery murders did not match. Despite this and the difference in weapons, they believed the 2 incidents were connected.
This is 2.7 miles from the first business. It's pretty hard to imagine these 2 types of crimes happening in our city and they not be connected.
Investigators contacted Deputy District Attorney General Tom Thurman. He would help organize the multi-agency investigation.
At this time, a task force was formed. The police, again, obviously, very intense investigation, attempting to find physical evidence. Police felt they had the same suspect. It appeared that we almost had a maniac on our hands.
The task force worked quickly to develop information.
That task force consisted of several police officers on a full-time basis answering telephones with a specifically designed phone number that would pertain only to this case.
Police also set up an email address to collect every possible lead.
They were getting all kinds of calls they were having to chase down. We're checking out every lead possible. I mean, the lead books were just amazing how many calls they had and people reporting things.
As police continued their investigation, the only survivor of either crime was recovering in the hospital. When his doctors allowed it, a detective went to interview Jose Gonzalez. As the only witness to the triple homicide at the hamburger restaurant, detectives hoped Gonzalez could help them identify and stop the killer. Gonzalez told them he and his fellow employees were just leaving the restaurant when a muscular white male forced them back inside at gunpoint.
What do you want? Get the money out of the city.
Training his gun on them, he made the manager open the safe and put the money in a bag.
Hurry. I'm getting the money.
He also emptied the registers.
Move it. Down.
He then forced the 4 employees into the storage room and told them to lie down side by side. The killer shot the first 3 employees twice in the head. When he got to Gonzalez and tried to fire, his revolver was empty.
Suspect started backing up, and Jose, scared to death, he jumps up and tried to fight. During the fight, he was knocked to the ground and started feeling the sharp pains in his back and his neck, head. He went down and played dead.
The killer ran off. The last thing Gonzalez remembered was dialing 911. In the spring of 1997, Nashville police believed a single killer had murdered 5 people while robbing 2 restaurants. One victim of the second attack survived, having been stabbed 17 times. Police interviewed Jose Gonzalez in the hospital. Gonzalez helped police create a sketch of the man who nearly killed him. The drawing closely resembled the suspect in the first attack at a seafood restaurant. Detective Sergeant Pat Bastiglione had been working that case. He now teamed up with Detective Mike Rowland.
Sergeant Bastiglione and I began working real close together at that point. We knew that the restaurants were going to be connected. We felt really strong they were going to be connected.
Police increased patrols around the area's dozens of fast food restaurants. They couldn't predict the killer's next target.
Clearly the pressure was on. We were trying to locate this person before he struck again.
A month after the second restaurant killings, police received a 911 call from an ice cream shop in Clarksville, Tennessee, just outside Nashville. The caller said he had driven to the ice cream parlor to pick up his teenage sister after work. When he arrived, the front door was unlocked, but no one seemed to be inside. The cash register and safe were open and empty. When he couldn't find his sister, he called 911. Police found no fingerprints or signs of a struggle. They determined that 16-year-old Michelle Mace and 22-year-old Angela Holmes were scheduled to work that night. Michelle's brother said he had dropped his sister off at the beginning of her shift. She was working that day with Angela Holmes. Just before 10 p.m., Michelle had called for a ride. That was the last time he had heard from his sister. The incident might be related to the other attacks.
Anybody that you know might have came by, saw him?
But this time, there were no bodies. Detective Robert Miller of the Clarksville Police Department was the lead investigator on the ice cream shop case.
I guess you hope that it's not going to be a homicide. You hope that maybe the girls are going to be found the next morning, that maybe even if it is a robbery, that something, they've been placed somewhere, and that we're going to find them.
Those hopes were dashed the next morning when police responded to a call from Dunbar State Park, 3 miles from the ice cream shop.
There was a man walking his dog around 9 o'clock, 9:30, who happened to be on one of the trails around a lake, and he found what he thought was either a mannequin or a body just in the water's edge. And we got out there. That area was secured. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigations had a crime scene team that came down.
They found the body of a young woman floating in the water near the edge of the lake. Her hands had been tied behind her back with an apron, and her throat had been slashed. 170 feet away, off a trail in the woods, they found the body of a second young woman. Her throat was also slashed.
It did appear that it was going to be the two girls, Michelle and Angela. They hadn't been positively identified yet, but we were pretty sure that that's who we had.
Arriving at the park minutes later was District Attorney General John Carney.
By the time that I had gotten there, both of these girls' bodies were found, because there had been a similar case in Nashville. Detective Pat Plastiglione from the Metro Police Department and other detectives actually came down to Clarksville, came out to the scene.
Autopsies confirmed that the victims were Michelle Mace and Angela Holmes. Police had a potential third case in the investigation of the restaurant murders.
I heard about 2 girls up at another fast food location up in Clarksville were kidnapped and murdered in the early morning hours. And we just froze and we said, please don't tell us this is going to be connected.
Actually, there was a shop here.
Detectives from Nashville Metro and Clarksville compared their cases. In each incident, the suspect cleared the safe and cash registers. Then he tried to kill any witnesses.
The ones at the park that we found were the first one.
The detectives concluded they were dealing with a serial killer. Assistant Attorney General Tom Henderson was brought in from Memphis to help coordinate an investigation that crossed jurisdictions. To him, the vicious manner of the latest murders indicated the killer was more dangerous than ever.
Gun, you don't have to think long to pull the trigger, and it doesn't take long to shoot somebody. It takes a long time. It's not easy to cut somebody's throat. It takes a while. It takes grim determination to slit somebody's throat like this man did. It's not something you do in an instant. You have to consciously continue to do it for a period of time.
Perhaps the killer had left some trace of himself behind in the third attack. Examiners at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab processed the apron used to tie one of the victim's hands. But the only DNA found on the apron belonged to the victim herself. Authorities held press conferences to ask the public for help.
We began to get an enormous amount of people calling in with information, so we started working on the leads. All said and done, probably close to 500 leads came in.
Police followed up on every call. But after several weeks, none of those leads had brought them any closer to their suspect. Detective Rowland and his team were worried that the killer had once again eluded them.
Everybody just kind of pulled together. Nobody was getting any sleep. We were working around the clock, and it's just an extremely frustrating situation.
Then 2 separate callers contacted police. They said they had driven past or stopped by the ice cream parlor around closing time on the night of the murders.
They told us that they had seen a red vehicle, some type of small red 4-door vehicle parked up near the door.
Another witness placed a red car at Dunbar State Park on the night in question. Investigators now believe they had a critical piece of information about the killer. Authorities increased their media campaign, re-releasing the composite sketch of the suspect, along with information about his possible red car. No new leads on the elusive serial killer's identity came in. But soon the case would break unexpectedly, and the killer would finally surface. In the spring of 1997, 7 people were murdered in Nashville by a serial killer who targeted restaurants late at night. Investigators believe the suspect drove a red car. Using the local media, authorities have been asking the public for their help. Soon, they got it. On June 1st, 1997, Mitch Roberts, the manager of a local family restaurant, spent a quiet evening with his family.
You expecting anybody?
He had an unexpected visitor.
Hi, Mr. Roberts.
He recognized the man as Paul Reed, a former employee.
I just wanted to explain to you what had happened. I have something in my car that'll prove that I'm...
Roberts had fired Reed 4 months earlier for fighting with a coworker.
Not some other time.
He was telling me that he was trying to get his life turned around and that he was sorry for what had happened to the store and he'd like to get his job back. And my wife said, "Could I speak to you a minute?" She said, "Who is this?" And I said, "Well, he's a cook that used to work for me that I fired." And she said, "There's something weird about him. Get rid of him." And I said, "Okay." So I came back and spoke with him a little more and kind of led him outside.
Reed told Roberts he had something in his car that would prove that one of his employees was stealing from the restaurant.
It was real dark, and we walked down to the drive, and it hit me instantly. It's a red car.
So,
Mitch Roberts had seen the reports about the alleged serial killer's red car.
And so I basically tried, to get away then, and get back to my family inside the house. I said, "Well, Paul, you call me tomorrow, and I'll talk to you about it." And so I turned to leave him, and he pulled a gun and told me he was going to blow my head off. And I asked him what it was all about. I said, "Paul, if this is a joke, it's not funny." And he said, "This isn't a joke, I mean it."
I mean, I don't know what you want, Paul. I'm the one that gave you a job when you were out of work.
The terrified father tried to keep Reed calm.
Just go on.
And as I stepped up on the porch, I'm not ashamed to tell you, I said, "God, help me. I'm going to fight him on the porch. Tell me what to do. He's not going to get back in my house." I backed in the house and fell around the corner of the door opening in case he shot through the door. And he pulled on the door a couple of times trying to get it open.
Open this door!
Roberts pretended he had a gun nearby and yelled for his wife to hand it to him.
And he bought that story and ran. We got the wooden door shut and locked. I called 911 and reported it.
Me in the house. He aimed the gun at my
Cheatham
head.
County deputies immediately responded.
He says if I go out to his car, he can...
And I went over the story of what had happened and was going to press charges, naturally, for assault. It'd been about 45 minutes and the phone rang.
Hello?
And it was Paul on the phone.
I don't believe you're calling.
Reed said he wanted to apologize.
Well, you're probably about the last person I expected would have called you.
A deputy picked up another extension.
Yes, this is...
And when he got on the phone, he said, "Yes, Mr. Reed, I understand. I'm here with Mr. Roberts and his family. Everything is fine. You're not in any trouble right now, but we need to clear this up before tomorrow. And I think that's a good idea that you come back to his house and we'll do this." So when Paul drove back to the house, there were 6 deputies here waiting for him.
Reed was taken into custody and charged with aggravated assault.
Why are you doing this? Come around in front car. I haven't done anything.
The friend who drove him to Robert's house was questioned and released. Recalling the restaurant's serial killer investigation, Mitch Roberts called the homicide department of the Nashville Metro Police.
And I talked to the police, Pat Pastiglione, the next morning. I said, Pat, you need to come to Cheatham County. They've got Paul Reed in a cell. He tried to kidnap me last night, and I think he's the one you're looking for in all these killings.
Pastiglione and Detective Mike Rowland wanted to interview Paul Reed immediately.
Once he's arrested, we go down to the Cheatham County Jail. I obtain a color photograph of him, as well as a black and white photograph. We also get a good copy of his fingerprints.
No.
The two detectives questioned Reed before he made bail on the assault charge. Reed said he did not know the victims of the restaurant murders. He had never even been to the restaurants involved in the case. Then, the interview took an odd turn. Reed began making bizarre claims. He told Detective Rowland he was under constant government surveillance and that he was the subject of mind control experiments.
His demeanor was really strange. He kind of talked in circles, and I think at some points he was trying to act a little crazy, maybe. It was a different interview.
The detectives returned to Nashville to check Reed's fingerprints against the partial thumbprint they had obtained earlier in the investigation.
We send him up to our ID technicians, let him match his fingerprints against the print found on the movie card that was found on Ellington Parkway.
A fingerprint expert examined comparison points on both sets of prints.
And match, we get a hit.
The fingerprints proved that Paul Reed had been in possession of a card from murder victim Steve Hampton's wallet. Finally, District Attorney General John Carney had a suspect.
Paul Reed became a suspect. The Metro Police Department in Nashville began the investigation in conjunction with the Clarksville Police Department and actually developed enough probable cause to get a search warrant to search Paul Reed's home.
With the warrant, detectives responded to the boarding house where Reed rented 2 rooms.
We were interested in getting anything that may link him to this crime, any sort of forensic evidence, any sort of trace evidence. That would mean clothing that may have been worn by the suspect, shoes that may have been worn by the suspect, anything taken from the businesses.
Police removed 9 pairs of shoes from the suspect's rooms. They hoped one of them matched shoe prints recovered from the first 2 murder scenes. Inside Reed's desk, investigators found a credit card receipt from a gas station located about a mile from the ice cream parlor. The date and time on the receipt placed Reed near the crime scene at the time of the murders. Investigators also took samples of carpet and upholstery fibers from Reed's car and sent them to the lab for analysis. Detective Robert Miller looked into Reed's background.
We were able to find out that he was from Texas. He had been to Nashville off and on a couple of times, lived here working fast food jobs. He came here hoping to be a country music star.
Reed was also an ex-con who had served 6 years of a 20-year sentence for aggravated armed robbery and attempted murder. Police learned he had been charged with 7 aggravated robberies in Houston. Investigators asked Jose Gonzalez to come to the station. He was the only survivor of the fast food killer's rampage. He picked Reed out of a photo lineup. On June 25, 1997, Paul Dennis Reed was indicted by a grand jury for the execution-style murders of Michelle Mace and Angela Holmes. Reed told the press he had not killed anyone. Prosecutor John Carney had no doubt he could prove to a jury that Reed was lying.
We knew the case very well, and we knew our witnesses, we knew our evidence that we had in the case. I always felt confident that we could convict Paul Reed. I just felt so strongly that we had a good case and that we did not, the only important thing was that we convinced 12 people that were in that box that we had a case against Paul Reed and that he was guilty of the crimes that he committed.
But the prosecutor might not get that chance. Paul Reed's defense lawyer filed a motion asserting his client was not mentally competent to stand trial. If a judge agreed, there would be no trial for a man prosecutors believed was a ruthless serial killer. "39-year-old Paul Reed had been indicted by a Tennessee grand jury for 7 murders and 3 separate attacks on restaurants. 2 of the charges stemmed from the violent murders of employees of a Clarksville ice cream parlor. Prosecutor John Carney believed his case was the strongest.
Our case here in Clarksville had the most evidence that linked Paul Reed to any one of the cases. We had the most physical evidence directly linking him to both of these murders.
The victims, 22-year-old Angela Holmes and 16-year-old Michelle Mace, were found in a state park near the ice cream shop where they worked. Their throats had been slashed. Their violent deaths outraged co-prosecutor Tom Henderson.
The first young lady he killed, we think he cut her throat from behind. And that caused the other one, of course, to run, but her hands were tied behind her back. He chased her down. You can just imagine in the dark, with your hands tied behind your back, having just seen your friend killed, knowing you're next, running through the brush, running through the trees, the sheer panic, the mental torment. She would have been able to feel her blood pressure dropping. She would have known she was dying and looked into the face of the man that was killing her.
Despite the severity of the charges, Reed's trial nearly ended before it began. His attorney had filed an 11th-hour motion claiming his client was not competent to stand trial. He suggested that physical and psychological trauma suffered as a child had resulted in the deterioration of his client's mental health.
Our response was that he may have had problems as a child, and we all had problems as a child, but that doesn't mean that you don't know what you're doing. You don't understand the difference between what's right and what's wrong.
After weeks of testing, psychologists determined Reed was competent to stand trial. Because of the heavy media coverage of the case, the jury had to be selected from outside Nashville. The Davidson County Public Defender's Office represented Paul Reed. His trial began in September of 1999. The prosecution's case began with a single slip of paper, a credit card receipt that placed the defendant near the scene of the crime.
Raise your right hand, please. You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. Please.
Paul Reed had a credit card that was used at a local gas station that was approximately 1 mile from the ice cream shop. And he had used that credit card approximately 6 minutes prior to their abduction. And we also had a witness in the case that fell in behind him as he pulled out of the local gas station and actually followed him up to the point that he passed the ice cream shop.
On cross-examination, the defense made sure the jury understood that the witness did not see the red car pull into the ice cream shop.
I drove out of the parking lot and there was this car ahead of me.
What kind of
The
car?
car had driven by without stopping.
It was a 4-door compact.
A second witness saw a red car pull into the parking lot of the ice cream parlor just as she was leaving.
That witness testified in court that they could put that car, the same color of car, at the ice cream shop at or around 1 minute before 10 o'clock at night when it closed up.
Very good. Now, could you tell
The
us what
defense
you saw
pointed
the
out
night
that
before
neither
you
witness
was
could
arrested?
testify that they actually saw Paul Reed driving the car.
Could you
Raise your right hand.
The prosecution next called the brother of one of the victims to the stand.
Tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Please be seated.
6 minutes after Paul Reed used a credit card to buy gas down the street, the young man arrived at the ice cream shop to pick up his sister, Michelle Mace.
As I arrived, I noticed all the lights were on, but nobody was inside.
His sister and her co-worker were gone. By 10 minutes after 10, he called the police. The prosecution contended that by the time police arrived at the ice cream parlor, Reed was already on his way to Dunbar State Park, where the victims were discovered. Prosecutors next focused on that second crime scene and tried to place Reed there. A young man testified that at 10:30 on the night of the murders, he and some friends saw a red four-door car parked at Dunbar Cave.
Could you tell me
Again,
what
the defense pointed out that the witness had only seen a car similar to the one Reed owned.
Ford Escort four-door with its lights on.
He had not actually seen Reed himself.
It was 10:40 p.m.
The prosecution had established that the ice cream parlor was the last place the victims were seen alive. Questioning a forensic specialist on the scene that night, the defense brought out a key point. None of the defendant's fingerprints or shoe prints were found in the ice cream parlor.
nothing to link the crime scene with my client?
Yes.
There was no forensic evidence to prove that Reed had ever been there.
Prosecution, would you like to ask some questions? No, Your Honor. Please be seated.
Prosecutors claimed they could prove that the victims, Michelle Mace and Angela Holmes, had been inside Paul Reed's car.
I am a forensics expert.
On the car in question, did you take...
Prosecutor John Carney called an expert in forensic fiber analysis, who believed fibers recovered from the victims matched those found on Reed's shoes.
There were 4 different fibers that were different and distinct from one another that were actually found on the victim's clothing and were also found on actually embedded into Paul Reed's shoes.
Thank you very much. Defense, would you like to prosecute?
To the prosecution, this was compelling evidence of Reed's guilt. On cross-examination, the defense asked if the fibers could have come from other cars. The fibers, she admitted, could have come from thousands of other vehicles.
Say that, but what I can say is that it would come from a car exactly like his. It would have to be a car with the exact same upholstery, the exact same carpet. It would come from a car.
The fiber expert also confirmed that a team of evidence technicians spent 13 hours searching Reed's car, but found no hairs or fibers from the victims inside.
Match my client's car.
To the defense, this was proof that Michelle Mace and Angela Holmes had never been in the defendant's car.
No further questions.
Point by point, the defense had countered the state's case against Paul Reed.
Thank you, ma'am. Be seated.
But the prosecution would next present forensic evidence that they hoped would prove conclusively that Reed was responsible for the deaths of the 2 girls at Dunbar State Park. In the fall of 1999, Paul Reed was on trial for capital murder in the deaths of 2 ice cream shop employees. Authorities believed he was a serial killer who murdered 7 people in 3 attacks on restaurants. At Reed's trial, the state called a DNA expert to the stand.
DNA profile.
Prosecutor John Carney questioned her about her examination of blood found on the defendant's shoes.
The things that directly linked Paul Reed to these murders were his shoes. Michelle Mace, his blood was found on the left tennis shoe of Paul Reed, and a mixture of both Angela Holmes and Michelle Mace's blood was found on the right shoe of Paul Reed.
Lead detective Robert Miller believed the DNA testimony would seal the case.
The defining moment of the case for me, we had a lot of circumstantial evidence as far as him being in Clarksville that night, being in that area that night, driving a red car, being seen by a witness that saw a red car on this particular roadway when there's not much traffic, and then slow down at the ice cream store. All of the circumstantial evidence was great, but when we had DNA proof, something that could not be denied by him, how much better do you get than you can say that you have the victim's blood on a pair of his shoes? And when we got that, I knew the case was solid, and I felt great.
Yes, I do, Your Honor.
But under cross-examination, the DNA expert admitted that she could not say with absolute certainty that the blood on the shoes belonged to the victims.
Are you considered a DNA expert?
There was a 1 in 2 million chance that the blood came from someone else. Prosecutors hoped the odds were enough to convince the jury. After calling more than 50 witnesses, the state rested its case. Hoping to cast suspicion on someone other than Reed, the defense called a friend of the victims who had been in the ice cream parlor shortly before 10 o'clock on the night of the murders. She testified that a man with long hair came into the shop that night. He argued with the victims over the prices and left. The witness said the man was very threatening. He did not look like Paul Reed. She testified that she left the shop minutes later, and Michelle Mace locked the doors behind her. That was the last time she saw either of her friends.
Thank you.
The defense hoped her testimony left reasonable doubt in the jurors' minds as to who committed the murders.
There's some things you need to know about my client's past.
If they had reasonable doubt, they could not convict. In closing arguments, the defense reminded the jury that the state's case was circumstantial.
He was found guilty.
They had not heard from a single witness who had seen Paul Reed with the victims.
My client in his youth.
According to the defense, the DNA evidence did not conclusively prove the victim's blood was on Reed's shoes, and the fibers on the victims could have come from a car exactly like Reed's. There was plenty of room for reasonable doubt as to Reed's guilt.
Can you sentence someone to death?
In their closing summation, prosecutors would have to tie the circumstantial evidence together.
And arguing
Assistant District Attorney General Tom Henderson used a circle diagram to show the probability of Reed's guilt.
Asking different questions.
We asked the jurors how many people were in Montgomery County the night of April the 23rd, 1997, who were familiar with the Dunbar Cave area, owned a small red car, needed money, had discussed robbery, had a knife, had car fibers that matched, had aftermarket floor mat fibers that matched, had blood on their shoes, had human blood on their shoes, and had the victim's blood on their shoes. There's only one person in the entire world that matches all those, and that's the defendant, Paul Dennis Reed.
On September 22, 1999, Reed was found guilty of the murders of Angela Holmes and Michelle Mace. In separate trials, he was also convicted of the murders of restaurant employees Steve Hampton, Sarah Jackson, Ronald Santiago, Robert Sewell, and Andrea Brown. Reed received a total of 7 death sentences, 1 for each victim. Paul Dennis Reed was sent to death row at Brushy Mountain State Prison in Tennessee. A peaceful community is shaken by violence on Halloween 1993. gunfire erupts, leaving 3 children wounded and 3 others dead. Prosecutors, detectives, and several brave families will not stop until the criminals are captured and their community restored. In 1993, when innocent teenagers are gunned down in Pasadena, California, the shocked community demands justice. LA County Assistant District Attorney Anthony Myers must find the killers and make sure they're taken off the streets forever.
There were families that were destroyed and devastated by this, and it reverberated throughout the community that the violence can reach anyone at any time, under any circumstance, and this sort of chaotic situation could not be allowed to stand.
Nestled against the mountains north of Los Angeles, Pasadena is a tranquil community of residential neighborhoods. The city is best known for its annual Tournament of Roses parade, when Pasadena plays host to tourists from around the world. But one Halloween night, violence erupted.
911, what is your emergency?
On October 31st, 1993, Pasadena police responded to a call of a shooting at the 500 block of Wilson Avenue. Bags of candy lay strewn across a lawn. Next to them lay the bodies of 3 murdered children. Detective Mike Corporal, with 15 years on the Pasadena Homicide Squad, was the lead investigator.
I wasn't on the rotation nor scheduled to be working this particular case. Myself and my partner, Bobby Reby, were off. It was about 10 minutes to 11 when I got a phone call from the on-duty watch commander, who told me that there had been a triple murder, and that 3 people had been wounded as well, and that they were calling all the detective bureau in.
Corporal and his partner, Detective Robert Uribe, arrived at the scene shortly before midnight. The sergeant at the scene briefed the detectives. The victims were a group of 7 boys. When gunfire erupted, only 1 escaped unharmed. 6 had been hit. 3 died from their wounds. It was Detective Uribe's first murder case.
3 young boys had been shot, ages about 12 to 13 years old, and that hit me right in the chest. I'm thinking, Halloween night, what's going on? Who is killing 12, 13-year-old kids?
While his partner canvassed the neighborhood in search of witnesses, Detective Corporal stayed at the scene.
It was a rather large crime scene. I took over the task of managing the crime scene itself at the location and directing our resources to collect the evidence, to maintain the integrity of the crime scene, started to look through the physical evidence and try to put together from the evidence that was present what might have taken place.
Crime scene technicians searched the area for clues. They recovered several shell casings, later determined to be from 9mm and .38 caliber handguns. They also found 3 unexpended .38 caliber rounds, known as wad cutters. Their being ejected meant the .38 might have been broken. Multiple shots fired from different guns indicated there were at least 2 shooters. Such a deliberate, violent attack against children surprised the detectives. Then an officer mentioned that one of the victims was the son of a fellow investigator, a woman who was already on the scene.
He told me that one of the other victims was Deborah Bush's son.
Deborah Bush was a crime scene investigator for the Pasadena Police Department. She had been the first to reach the boys after the shooting.
She would work with me on other murder cases where she would come in my direction, collect evidence. So there was a personal connection at that point in time that made it much more difficult for all of us.
Deborah Bush's younger son, Kenny, was the only one in the group who escaped unharmed. His 14-year-old brother, Stephen, was pronounced dead at the scene. The two other fatalities were 14-year-old Reggie Crawford and 13-year-old Edgar Evans. The three wounded boys had been taken to local hospitals. Neighbors reported that between 15 and 20 shots had been fired, but no one could give detectives clear descriptions of the shooters or their cars.
Everybody that we talked to heard the shots. And nobody looked out and saw anything of great importance at that time. They saw people running, shadows running. They saw vehicles leaving.
Based on the location of the ejected shell casings, investigators determined that the shooters had ambushed the teens from behind a row of shrubs. Investigators at the scene contacted Assistant District Attorney Anthony Myers.
Crime scene investigation is a very important part in the prosecution of a case. It sometimes can be the difference between winning and losing a case. In this case, consisted of basically gathering the ballistics evidence. Also, there was blood evidence at the scene. There were footprints at the scene.
Each item of evidence would be processed at the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department Crime Lab. After the wounded boys were released from the hospital, they spoke with detectives. Investigators needed more details of what had happened that night. Due to the brutal nature of the attack, police suspected gang involvement. The boys insisted they were not members of any gangs. They were buddies from middle school and had just attended a birthday party for a fellow classmate. The boys were getting in some last-minute trick-or-treating before heading home. The trouble began outside a corner market.
And me and my friends walking the street, and a car came past and almost hit my friend Reggie.
The group was standing outside the market when two cars slowly cruised by. One of the boys, Reggie Crawford, gestured toward the cars. The men inside were dressed in gang colors. The boys dismissed the incident and continued on to the home of Stephen and Kenny Coates. Minutes later, as they walked along the sidewalk, gunshots rang out. The boy never saw the shooters.
What did you see?
Because it was night and it happened so fast and there were gunshots flying and the assailants basically stalked their prey and attacked through ambush. The kids who were trick-or-treating and were gunned down and shot didn't have a chance to basically make an identification.
Detectives held a briefing the next day for the investigative team assigned to the case.
A case of this magnitude in a city like Pasadena generated a lot of interest. A lot of calls from citizens concerned, and those who thought they had seen something were coming in. So this myriad of information was being deposited with us, and we had the task of trying to assemble it into something that was usable.
The men in the cars had worn colors associated with the Bloods, a major West Coast gang. Police believed the boys might have been mistaken for members of the Bloods' rival gang, the Crips.
Come down
We had black gangs, Hispanic gangs, and white gangs. We had different blocks of neighborhoods who have different names, but they would align themselves with either the Bloods or the Crips. So that to a certain extent focused our attention in that direction, but we had nothing solid.
Detectives reviewed neighbors' statements. One resident said he saw men wearing gang colors leave their cars and run toward Wilson Avenue. Moments later, he heard gunshots. The men ran back to the cars and drove away. It was too dark to make out license plates. An investigator reported that he'd received an anonymous tip by phone that morning. The caller claimed that the deadly ambush was the work of P9 gang members. The P9s were known to police as a small but vicious group allied with the larger Bloods gang. The team would look into the P9 gang's activities. Detectives Corporal and Uribe went to question Officer Deborah Bush and console her on the loss of her son. A single mother raising 4 children, Bush had been a crime scene investigator with the Pasadena Police Department for 3 years. But more than that, she was a mother who needed to know how her son had died and why.
Basically, Stephen died before he hit the ground, and I knew he didn't suffer. He didn't ask for me. He didn't even know. It was just basically over very soon. Very quick for him. I mean, he didn't, once he was shot, he was, for all intents and purposes, he was dead, so he didn't suffer. And as a mom, I had to know that.
She told detectives that her sons had gone out to a party that evening and had planned to go trick-or-treating.
And Stephen was 14, but he was 1 month from turning 15, so I kind of joked about, you know, aren't you a little old for trick-or-treating? And he said, no, got to get that candy as long as I can.
She told Stephen to watch his younger brother Kenny and to be home by 10:30. That evening, Deborah was driving her daughter and a friend home when she saw Stephen and Kenny. It was almost 10:30.
We can meet you home.
The boys told their mom they didn't need a ride and that they would race her back home.
We had done this game before, I'll race you home type thing. I remember driving down the street and I pulled in my driveway. Well, before I can get out of the car, that's when I heard the first series of shots.
She immediately knew something was wrong. Then, another burst of gunfire rang out. She ran toward the shots, knowing the boys were nearby. She found her son Stephen shot in the head.
Somebody call the police, call the paramedics!
Deborah's son Kenny confirmed the story detectives had received from the other boys interviewed and added an important detail.
At the convenience store.
Through the bushes, the 13-year-old had glimpsed one of the shooters. He said the large black male had a ponytail and wore a red bandana. With only a vague description, finding the man in the secretive underworld of street gangs would be difficult and tax the resources of the police department. Pressure was on investigators from the public and City Hall to solve these murders as quickly as possible. Detectives Corporal and Uribe knew they needed the public's assistance and asked Deborah Bush to speak to the press.
We need to get out an appeal to the public for them to turn in information that they might know to them. So it was very, very difficult. I wanted to do my part to help get these people behind bars.
Investigators hoped the outraged community could help them find the shooters and get them off the streets. When 3 teenage boys were killed in a bloody ambush on Halloween night, 1993, it stunned the tranquil suburb of Pasadena, California. It seemed gang warfare had come to Pasadena. Like the rest of the community, Assistant District Attorney Anthony Myers was disturbed by the indiscriminate nature of the crime.
Anytime you have anybody gunned down in the middle of the night, it's a horrible crime. I think the fact that the victims in this case were so young increases the horror exponentially.
A candlelight vigil was held several days after the slaying. The town council authorized a $40,000 reward for any information that would lead to the identity of the killers. Pasadena homicide detective Mike Corporal believed a gang known as the P9s was involved. Soon he got a lead from a report of another crime that might be related to the killings.
We received a call from a woman who was concerned that her son might be the target of an attempted homicide. And we met with her and spoke to her, and she explained to us that on the night of the Halloween murders, on October 31st, that her house had been shot up by individuals that her son described as being P9 gang members.
Detectives learned the woman's son used to be in a gang that was a rival of the P9s. The son told detectives he had heard the P9s had shot into the house, seeking revenge for the death of a P9 gang member. Checking the lawn, the detectives discovered several 9mm shell casings, like those at the triple murder scene on Wilson Avenue.
But what really piqued our curiosity was when we found one unexpended wad cutter .38 round.
3 similar unexpended rounds had been found at the site of the triple homicide. If examiners could prove the bullets were from the same gun, it would tie the 2 incidents together and indicate a gang crime spree. Examiners compared the bullet fragments from each of the 3 victims to the live rounds recovered. Their analysis confirmed that the weapon that fired the fatal shots was the same gun that left wad cutters at the former gang member's house. But detectives could not determine who had fired the weapons. No fingerprints, hairs, fibers, or even clear descriptions pointed toward the shooters.
Got the diagrams from last night.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. You got the evidence photos?
Detectives Corporal and Uribe hoped they could develop street informants.
I think it's number 29B.
They knew younger gangs keep low profiles while organizing their territory. But the violent P9s bragged of their exploits to increase intimidation on the streets.
The P9s were a little bit different in that the P9s consisted of more of older gang members, if you will, and I don't mean ancient old, I mean 18, 19, 20-year-olds. But their background in the narcotics trafficking, they kind of made them more prone to violence.
One of the victims had a back pocket.
If the P9s had bragged of their latest violent acts, detectives needed to find witnesses who had heard details of the shootings.
Locating those witnesses was accomplished by good old-fashioned detective work.
The investigative team worked their contacts on the streets, picking up known gang associates, tracking down others already in jail,
Yeah, I have some information for you. What do you want?
and chasing any leads that came in.
Precinct Sergeant.
Slowly, the details began to outline the gang and its violent lieutenants. Investigators noted that the same names kept coming up as being possible shooters.
In a gang, there's only a handful of individuals, 1 or 2 usually, who have who are crazy enough and who are respected enough to actually be called the trigger men.
Lorenzo Newborn fit that description. Newborn was known to police as one of the founders of the P9 gang. From informants, investigators learned that early on the evening of October 31st, Lorenzo Newborn was with the group outside a local hospital. A fellow P9 gang member had been brought there after being shot. Newborn said a rival gang was responsible for the shooting. When the gang member was pronounced dead, the informant heard Newborn calling for revenge killings. Police also learned the name of another gang member, Carl Holmes. Holmes had allegedly boasted of his involvement in the killings of the 3 boys on Halloween. When news of the $40,000 reward spread, others in the gang community began talking.
By posting a reward, that created other problems, though, because then we were tasked with the responsibility of making sure that the motivation for coming forward wasn't monetary.
Several weeks after the murders, police developed an informant with information on another ruthless gang member, Herbert McLean. He had also bragged about the shooting, believing he'd taken out members of the rival Crips gang.
Yo, I could still hear the sounds. I could still hear the sounds. It was like pop, 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 man, boom.
McLean also wore his hair in a ponytail. He fit the description Deborah Bush's son Kenny gave police.
So the informants all started pointing their fingers towards Lorenzo Newborn, Carl Holmes, and Herb McLean, among others.
Detective Uribe and other investigators found sources to back up witnesses' claims. But sources only talked when they felt safe.
We wanted to be guaranteed that we could protect them, that we could help them, stay alive. That's life in the city up here. That was life in the gang areas.
The sources implicated 2 more gang members. Solomon Bowen and Aurelius Bailey were both seen plotting outside the hospital the night their fellow gang member died. Informants said Bailey owned a .38 caliber weapon, a gun that was broken and often spilled unexpended wad cutter rounds, like the gun fired at both crime scenes. But if police didn't recover the gun, the forensics would be meaningless. After nearly 2 months of investigation, the case of the Halloween murders focused on 5 P9 gang members: Newborn, McLean, Holmes, Bailey, and Bowen. To investigators, the motive was clear. They knew the gang members were violent and had vowed on October 31st to avenge the death of their fellow gang member. The bandanas worn by some of the victims could have been mistaken for the colors of a rival gang. The triple murder was a tragic case of mistaken identity.
Gang members tend not to be discriminate in their acts of violence, so in that sense, I was not surprised. They do not surgically strike. They take out whatever's in their way.
Unwilling to let the P9 gangsters kill other innocent victims, law enforcement planned to take them down. On December 23, 1993, the district attorney's office charged the 5 suspects with 3 counts of murder each. Armed with search and arrest warrants, members of the Pasadena homicide squad joined forces with the FBI for a special operation intended to take all 5 suspects into custody simultaneously.
The locations that we intended to search included the suspects' homes and the addresses that we knew that they lived in. Detective teams were put together, headed up by personnel from the homicide section, and were dispatched to each of those locations.
On my mark. 1, 2, 3. Go, 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 go.
We specifically picked a date that we did because it was so close to Christmas that we were confident that based upon previous experiences that we've had with these gang members, that there are only a couple of days that they hold sacred to themselves. One of them is Mother's Day, and the other one is Christmas. So that close to Christmas, we were hopeful that we'd catch them all at home.
At the end of the raids, only 3 of the men were in custody. Bowen and McLean remained at large. Then in January 1994, police arrested Solomon Bowen at his mother's home. The publicity about the hunt for McLean turned up new information. One of the neighbors interviewed the night of the crime contacted the police. He said he recognized the photo he had seen on
I
television.
want you to tell the detective here what you told me over the phone. Okay, well.
When he first spoke to police, he had been unable to provide a full description of the men who fled the scene.
Come on, man, let's go.
But after seeing the suspects' photos on TV, he recognized 2 of them immediately, Carl Holmes and Herbert McLean.
That's him.
That's him?
Yeah. That's the guy.
On January 18, 1994, Herbert McLean turned himself in to authorities. He said he was tired of running.
Sure. And please follow me out. Okay.
The men believed to be responsible for the Halloween murders were in police custody. Now Assistant District Attorney Anthony Myers had to keep them there.
My other responsibility is getting the case in a posture so that it can be presented to a grand jury so that they can determine whether or not there is sufficient evidence to take these defendants to trial.
Instead of a preliminary hearing with witnesses testifying in open court, the prosecutor used a closed grand jury session.
Now listen, what you told the grand jury was very important.
Transcripts of the session were sealed from the public, and the names of witnesses could even be withheld from defense attorneys.
It is extremely dangerous for gang members in particular to testify against their own. Even though we were able in some of these cases to provide relocation funds and to move them into safe houses, several of them felt very uncomfortable in the new environments and returned to the city, putting themselves at grave risk.
Then the prosecutor learned just how grave the risk was. It was the news that every prosecutor dreads. A key witness had been murdered. As prosecutors prepared for the trial of P9 gang members in the killing of 3 Pasadena boys, they received the shocking news that one of their witnesses had been gunned down in the street.
And get him out of town before they all bolt.
The witness's testimony against members of the P9 gang had made a significant impact on the grand jury. His death just before trial would have an even greater impact on other witnesses on the street. The news traveled quickly through the gang community, according to homicide detective Mike Corporal.
When the witness was murdered, quickly fear spread through the ranks of the other witnesses that we had. They all assumed that the murder occurred as a result of his testimony.
Come in. If you come in, we can protect you.
The tragedy put the state's case in jeopardy. The prosecutor asked detectives to maintain close contact with the remaining witnesses and assure them they were safe.
He doesn't want to come in. He doesn't want to testify.
But many witnesses in the gang community wondered if the police could really protect them.
Hello? This is Detective Corporal.
One man preferred not to take any chances. Prosecutor Anthony Myers learned the witness fled the city.
The witness testified at the grand jury, but as trial approached, this witness went deep underground, disappearing to parts unknown, possibly Minnesota, possibly Arkansas. We did what we could to try to locate him. We brought his mother to court, we brought his sister to court, we had the FBI look for him, with no luck. A cornerstone, as it were, of our case was removed from our foundation, and we had to scramble to present other evidence and hope that the case would not topple.
To be ready by the court date, Myers needed assistance restructuring the prosecution. Assistant District Attorney John Lynn Callahan was assigned to the case.
I had to go back through all the transcripts. We had grand jury transcripts. We had many taped transcripts. Most of the witnesses, if not all of the witnesses, were taped. I had thousands of pieces of crime reports, and I just had to get up to speed.
With one key witness dead and another missing, the prosecutors agreed that the remaining evidence primarily implicated 3 of the 5 defendants: Lorenzo Newborn, Herbert McLean, and Carl Holmes.
We made a decision that we would go with the strongest evidence and all the statements we could get in, and those amounted to the first 3 defendants. We had the strongest evidence against them.
The 2 others, Solomon Bowen and Aurelius Bailey, would be tried later. The murder trial of Newborn, McLean, and Holmes began on October 10, 1995, nearly 2 years after the triple murder. It was an emotional time for Deborah Bush, the police officer whose son was killed in the shooting.
So this is my first time seeing these people face to face. I mean, I saw pictures, but seeing them face to face and being in that courtroom, and then realize it's not like on TV. Everybody's a lot closer, and this is real life, and you're in a very, very small room, and the distance between you and them is not a big one.
All rise and give your attention. Honorable Justice J.D. Smith, Superior Court of the State of California.
For the prosecutors, it would be an uphill battle.
We were not able to recover any guns. We were not able to recover any fingerprints. There were no other physical pieces of evidence to tie the defendants to the crime.
And most of their witnesses, who'd heard the defendants boast of the crime, were felons and gang members themselves.
Mr. Meyer, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, sir. Prosecutors needed to convince the jury that the evidence, though circumstantial, clearly placed the defendants at the crime scene, armed and out for revenge on the night in question.
Candy, costumes, but for Pasadena.
I wanted the jury to make sure that they understood that this wasn't happenstance, but rather that this was a planned, well thought out execution.
The prosecutors were up against a powerful defense team.
I stand before you right now to let you know.
The defense claimed that the state's case was built on testimony elicited from criminal witnesses paid from a $40,000 reward fund.
Of the homicides in which he is accused.
$40,000 does not buy a heck of a lot of security, and when you're testifying against gang members, it certainly that sort of money is not going to be what compels one to testify. In this case, what brought the individuals forward was the fact that there were innocent children who were gunned down in a remorseless and heinous manner.
One of the first witnesses for the prosecution, however, would be unimpeachable. Deborah Bush took the stand. She told the jury what happened after she heard the gunshots.
Got to the first person, check a pulse, and realized that person was dead. I had no idea that there was actually going to be somebody there that was actually going to be dead. The second person that I checked, I noticed there was a bullet hole lodged in the back of their head, and that person was dead, but that was my son.
I do recall seeing tears in some of the eyes of the jury. I think the emotional impact of hearing that somebody went to the crime scene and she rolled over a body, and that was the body of her son. There is no doubt that had an emotional impact on every single person hearing it.
No further questions.
The defense chose not to cross-examine Deborah Bush. Not all witnesses for the prosecution would be as sympathetic or credible.
Witnesses will be recanting. That witnesses will be saying things on the witness stand different than that which they told the police. And I wanted the jurors to be aware that in a gang case, that sort of situation is typical.
Didn't you tell detectives that McLean said...
Perhaps due to fear of gang reprisal, a witness who had once told police that McLean bragged about the killing now recanted his statement.
No further questions.
The defense took advantage of the witness's revised story.
Defense, any questions?
The police pressured you into making those statements, did they not?
They suggested that police intimidated witnesses into making incriminating statements against the defendants.
Yes, it is true.
Thank you, Your Honor.
During a court recess, prosecutors discovered that another witness was on the verge of recanting his testimony.
I don't know. What about my family?
The man had been receiving death threats, even in Chicago, where he'd been relocated for his own protection. Now, in the courtroom, he'd spotted a woman with close ties to the P9 gang members who wanted him dead, according to Detective Uribe.
No, this isn't right.
He got real nervous about that, and at one point asked us for a recess and went back. I can't do this. There's so-and-so sitting in the audience, man, and they're calling back east with this information. You know, what about my family? What about my wife back there?
Solve this.
Afraid for his family, the witness wanted to leave court. The detective also received a threat in a coded message sent through his pager. The page read 187, the police code for homicide. Uribe believed P9 members had sent it.
I took it as, watch your back, we're watching you type of thing.
Prosecutors knew that if they lost another witness due to intimidation, their case could collapse. In the case of the Pasadena Halloween murders, the prosecution had to endure every possible setback concerning witnesses. One witness was killed before the trial. Others had disappeared rather than testify against the P9 gang. Now one intimidated witness threatened to walk out in the middle of his testimony.
Listen, I have your wife on the phone right here. I'm gonna talk to your wife.
He believed his family, held in a safe house 1,000 miles away, was in danger. Detective Robert Uribe tried to assure him of their safety.
So, we called Chicago PD and had them go back and check on his wife and kids, make sure they were okay. And once he got word that everything was fine, he continued testifying.
Those gang members.
Prosecutors decided to confront the intimidation in open court and on the record.
You're indicating the woman in the leather jacket?
Yes.
Could you testify more fully if she were out of the courtroom?
Yes.
Your Honor, I move that she be excluded from the courtroom at this moment.
I will ask the
The
person
judge
with
ordered the
leather
woman
jacket
from the courtroom.
to step out momentarily.
The witness was then able to testify he had heard defendant Carl Holmes bragging about committing murders.
How he had shot.
Holmes and co-defendant Herbert McLean were also identified by the next witness called. Prosecutor Anthony Meyer's only eyewitness.
The eyewitness in this case was critical. There was only one witness who was able to say, I was at the murder scene or nearby the murder scene, and I saw individuals involved in that shooting.
What did you see?
The witness said a small sports car pulled up next to him that night. He made eye contact with the driver, Herbert McLean. McLean and several other men then got out of their cars and cut through the bushes, headed towards Wilson Avenue.
The next thing I know, these people come rushing past me again.
The witness said the men leapt out of the bushes seconds after shots were fired.
Come on, man, let's go.
He saw McLean driving away from the scene. He could identify Holmes as being one of the other men. In cross-examination, the defense noted that it was dark and the witness had only seen the men for a few seconds. The defense reminded jurors that the witness had not been able to positively identify the defendants the night of the crime, but came forward only when a reward was offered and the suspect's photos appeared on TV.
No further questions, Your
He
Honor.
just stood his ground and said, look, you know, I know that I saw your client's face. Now, if you're asking me all these questions about distances, time, space, I can't really be accurate.
The prosecution had each of the surviving victims testify, but none could identify their attackers.
Place your left hand on the floor. Raise your right hand.
Then, on the final day of testimony for the prosecution, Kenny Coates took the stand. Kenny had been uninjured in the ambush, but his brother had been killed.
Hi, Kenny.
Hi.
Kenny, you're Stephen Coates' brother.
Prosecutors saved his testimony for last in
On
their
the night
case.
of Halloween, 1993, can you tell the jury what happened that night?
Well, we were walking towards my house, and then we turned up towards my block.
He told the court that the boys had been walking along the street when he heard someone in the bushes shout, "Now, blood."
Everybody just went the wrong way. And
What happened next?
Kenny knew he had to go back for his brother. Returning to the scene, he saw his mother and sister.
Say my brother, man.
The family was distraught.
My brother. Gosh, man, this ain't my brother.
Kenny wanted to hold his brother, but his mother restrained him.
You could like.
As a crime scene investigator, she knew they couldn't disturb any evidence left behind.
Thank you. I have nothing further, Your Honor.
He was very brave, very determined. He was not going to back down, and it was clear that he was there to speak for his brother.
After Kenny's moving testimony, the prosecution rested. Defense attorneys called on witnesses who tried to provide alibis for the defendants.
At any time, did you ever leave
A
your
former
sight?
girlfriend of Lorenzo Newborn testified he'd been with her the entire night in question.
No further questions, Your Honor.
The prosecution countered by pointing out she had never before brought this to the attention of authorities, according to prosecutor John Lynn Callahan.
Does the defense
I
have
think
any
we were
further
able to poke
questions?
holes in the defense case. We were able to impeach them with other evidence, other witnesses.
The defense called an expert in eyewitness identification. Citing studies on memory, she cast doubt on the testimony of the state's eyewitnesses.
Good morning, Dr. Pesday.
Good morning.
How reliable is eyewitness identification testimony?
It's not very reliable at all. In fact, it's the least accurate testimony there is.
And why is that?
Well, there's just so many factors that come into
Certainly I was concerned that a jury might give undue weight to a quote-unquote expert in identification testimony. You know, you can never tell if a particular juror believes a particular witness.
For 2 days, the prosecutors cross-examined the expert witness, hoping to discredit her. With no physical evidence linking the defendants to the triple murder, they needed to show jurors that they could believe the eyewitnesses to the crime. Otherwise, the killers could go free.
a brief period of time.
3 Pasadena youths had been gunned down on Halloween night, 1993. Prosecutors believed they had found the men responsible, but with little evidence, the case was in jeopardy.
Tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you.
Of the 3 men on trial, Herbert McLean was the only defendant to testify on his own behalf.
I have a few questions I'd like to ask you. Did you participate in any shootings that occurred 10/31/93?
No, I didn't.
Prosecutor
Did you
Anthony Myers
participate in
was
any
glad to
shootings that
cross-examine the
occurred
defendant.
on that particular Halloween night?
Let me mark this man as an exhibit, and I'm going to mark it as exhibit number 1, what a murderer looks and acts like.
McLean's apparent strategy was to own up to his criminal past,
Prosecutors, any questions?
hoping jurors would then believe that all of his testimony was truthful. He admitted to being out on that Halloween, looking for rival Crips.
Mr. McLean, where were you on Halloween night '93?
We were out. I was out looking for some Crips.
Where'd you go?
I had every spot. I don't know. I probably hit all the hoods. I went looking not only for my boys, but I was also keeping my eye out for any Crips that I may find.
To do what?
What'd I just tell you? Smoke them. Kill them.
I
He
imagine you're
claimed
not
he was
too happy
innocent.
being up here on
He
the
claimed the
stand
informants were all liars. And he claimed to be as violent and vengeful as the prosecution alleged.
I ain't kill no kids. He's trying to make all
His
these people
candor
believe that
shocked
me
the
and my boys
jury
would do something
and
like
helped the
this.
prosecution's case.
Man, you ain't had no case from the jump. Then you want to bring in all these...
He just made a lot of statements that were clearly made by someone who knows how to kill, has been involved in killing, and associates with those who would also kill. And I think that was devastating.
In December 1995, after nearly 2 months and 70 witnesses, the attorneys made their closing arguments in the case.
Circumstantial evidence.
The defense reminded jurors that many of the witnesses were known criminals themselves.
It is the state's.
They argued that some witnesses' testimony had been purchased with reward money.
I thank you for your time and thank you, Your Honor.
The prosecution conceded that some had received a reward, and many had criminal records, but they had all risked their lives to testify against the P9 gang members.
Any other Halloween night. This would come right out of
The state's case hinged on these witnesses, who saw the defendants plotting revenge, brandishing weapons, and fleeing the crime scene. According to California law, anyone involved in such a conspiracy is equally guilty of murder. A week passed with no word on the verdict.
Every time the phone rings, you get sort of knot in your stomach, is that the verdict?
For Detective Mike Corporal, the tension was immense.
This was the worst case I ever worked. I mean, without a doubt, it was absolutely the worst case, and it was because of the personal side of it.
When his partner, Detective Robert Uribe, told him there was a verdict, he couldn't go to court to hear it read.
I called Mike, and Mike says, I can't, man, you got to do it. And I said, all right, and I showed up there, I sat at the table, and the knot in my stomach and, the pain in my chest, and just anticipating, what they're going to come out with.
The emotionally charged trial was about to end.
And then when Rhonda, the court clerk, stood up and started reading the verdict, I thought, oh man, this is it, we're on our way.
On this date of December 22nd,
On December 22nd, 1995, the verdicts were read in the murder trial of Lorenzo Newborn, Herbert McLean, and Carl Holmes.
On the second count of first-degree murder, guilty.
Each was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. They were sentenced to death. The remaining 2 suspects, Aurelius Bailey and Solomon Bowen, pleaded guilty to lesser charges. Bailey received a 42-year suspended sentence for manslaughter. Bowen earned a 12-year sentence for assault with a deadly weapon. For prosecutor John Lynn Callahan, the case signaled a new era in her community.
Pasadena had a history of being the home of the Rose Bowl, the home of the Rose Parade, and people didn't realize that there was a gang problem. And maybe the city itself and the people who lived there never wanted to admit that they had a gang problem. I think it was a wake-up call for everyone in the city. And it would extend to even the other cities that you do have to be concerned about your kids being out at night, even on a day such as Halloween, when you think your kids are safe.
Deborah Bush still mourns the loss of her son and has become a national speaker, giving lectures to young people on the perils of gang life.